A decision on the fate of the Hunter Valley Power Station at the centre of a political stoush could be imminent. Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull will meet AGL Chief Andy Vesey on Monday in a bid to persuade him to sell the Liddell plant so that its life can be extended beyond 2022. Yesterday, the energy company told the Australian Stock Exchange it had made no commitment to that effect, but both Treasurer Scott Morrison and Energy Minister Josh Frydenberg insist all options are still on the table. For more on that story, I was joined earlier from Adelaide by the Shadow Minister for Energy and Climate Change, Mark Butler. Mark Butler, many thanks for joining us.
Hi, Emma.
Put yourself in the government's shoes. Do you look to extend the life of coal-fired power stations to keep the lights on in New South Wales?
No, I look to implement a clean energy target. I mean, this is the problem with this distraction that Malcolm Turnbull has raised over the last couple of days. It takes attention away from the core recommendation of the Energy Market Operators report this week, which is to get on with the job of putting in place an investment framework. The Australian Energy
Council...
But
hold on, sorry for the interruption, but specifically drawing you back to the question about keeping the lights on in New South Wales, which was a genuine concern expressed in the AEMO report. Do you not consider, as part of that objective, keeping that coal-fired power station running a little longer?
Well, of course, everyone wants to make sure we keep reliable power in New South Wales and all of the other states. But the idea that there would be a shortfall, or the projection there might be a
Can you answer my question? I'm so sorry to keep pressing you, but would you consider...
I don't accept the premise.
You don't accept the idea that to keep the lights open... You don't accept the premise that it was articulated in the AEMO report that, that there is going to be a shortfall?
Yes, because the AEMO projection that there would be a shortfall assumes that the investment strike that we're currently seeing in the country continues for the next 5 years. I mean, as Matthew Warren at the Energy Council said today, we don't have a problem with old plants closing. The problem is that we don't have a plan to replace them. And I know that if we put a clean energy target in place, which was the core recommendation of the Energy Market Operator, that we would see substantial investment flow in New South Wales, including firming capacity.
Where would that investment flow go? What's the alternative in terms of reliable, affordable, dispatchable power that can fill the gaps that are coming down the line as these old legacy power stations are closed?
Well, in New South Wales, it would almost certainly be solar power and wind power. New South Wales is underdone in renewable energy.
So how do you store it, though? How do you make it dispatchable?
Well, there would be storage investment, I suspect, as well, but also AGL has made the point, and others have, that there is a likelihood of additional gas peaking plant being invested over the next few years. Indeed, there were reports today that those are plans that AGL has on foot as well and is considering. So this is the central point. AEMO's projections, whether they're about New South Wales or any other state, assume that the current position we find ourselves in, which is one of investment freeze and deep energy crisis, continues into the future. That's why it is so important we change the frame and we actually sit down and negotiate a bipartisan clean energy target. So let me go back to your questions.
Let me go back to my question about coal. Does that mean that Labor would not extend the life of any coal-fired power station in Australia if you were in the same position today the government finds itself in?
Well, we would put all of the options on the table. This is the problem.
Can you just give me a yes or no?
No, I can't just give you a yes or no, because Malcolm Turnbull was pretending this is the only option New South Wales has.
Well, there just doesn't seem to be much consistency, Mark Butler, from Labor on this. A Senate motion last year, co-sponsored by Labor's Sam Dastyari, to encourage the retirement of coal-fired power stations. Then just last month, Labor supported a Senate motion not to force the early retirement of coal-fired power stations. Which one is it?
Well, the point about Liddell is that AGL has made the decision to close Liddell in 2022. It is the only organisation that has crunched the numbers about an extension beyond those years, and obviously it takes the view it doesn't stack up. Commentary over the course of the last 48 hours indicates that it would cost hundreds of millions of dollars to extend the life of Liddell for a few years, and what I guess the alternative is that Malcolm Turnbull's not looked at, because it involves taking the hard decision decision of implementing a clean energy target is spending those hundreds of millions of dollars instead on new generation and firming capacity like battery storage and gas peaking plant that will last New South Wales several decades, not just several years. So, you just can't make these decisions.
I want to know Labor's position on coal. Addressing the National Press Club, you said Labor would introduce a framework to kickstart the closure of coal-fired power stations. Is that still the policy?
Well, it's not, because it was a policy in a very different context. What we were hearing from the industry, this was a policy developed in 2015 when the industry was saying there were
that was your address to the National Press Club last year.
Yep, that's right.
But it's no longer your policy.
They were saying there were barriers to exit of coal-fired power stations that was causing a block on investment. Now, what we've seen since is Hazelwood close and a number of companies make announcements about the closure date, for example, by the AGL of Liddell in 2022. There are no longer barriers to exit. So the policy that we had in place then to sort of start this process off is really otiose now, because the industry has started it itself. As Matthew Warren said this morning, it's no longer a question about old power plants closing. The challenge is to get replacement plant built, and that's the problem with not having a clean energy target for 4 years.
And you don't want there to be blackouts in the meantime. And the fact of the matter is the AEMO report has recognised that Victoria and South Australia are the two states where the need is most urgent, and it can't be a coincidence that that's where Northern and Hazelwood have closed.
Obviously.
And there's been nothing to step into the breach.
And that is the point that everyone's making. As these things inevitably close, because they were built in the 60s and 70s, nothing is being built because there's no investment framework. This government came into power 4 years ago today. They knew what they were going to dismantle and destroy. They haven't put a new policy in place.
When you were in government and you had a renewable energy target and so on, you didn't actually have any policy adjunct to that about storage. In hindsight, should you have?
Well, there's no problem right now about dispatchability of power. None of the events that have happened over the last 12 months are because there's a problem with dispatchability. There have been events because of storms. There have been events because there's not enough supply in the system.
No, but the point is the reports that are coming out are pointing you in that direction, that that is coming down the line.
And clearly in the second phase of deployment of renewable energy, still the country's only at about 15% renewable energy, much of which is hydro. But clearly everyone understands that in the next stage of deployment, we are going to have to look at taking advantage of the incredible technological revolution in storage, in battery storage, continue to ensure there's gas peaking plant, and look at pumped hydro as well. But that's not a problem today.
Well,
that's
no,
a
but
problem
you have
in
to
the
look
future.
down the horizon.
Of course.
What about the role of gas? You've mentioned that. Labor received warnings in government that the approval of gas export projects would increase domestic power prices. Why didn't you ensure there was enough supply to meet local demand?
No, let's be clear what we received warnings of, what we received advice of, which a Year 10 economics student could have told us, and that is that when John Howard removed export controls on gas 20 years ago and started to drive an LNG industry that would link Australia to the global market, of course then we'd be paying global prices like we do for other globally traded commodities like oil and black coal and many others besides. That wasn't in doubt, but we were given very clear assurances by the industry that they would not impact local supply, the supply that power generators and manufacturers and households had depended upon for decades.
But
indeed,
hold on,
Santos.
it was made clear in 2012 when you were a senior minister that there was an Australian Energy Market Operator report, and in your own energy white paper, you were told that an increase in gas exports on the east coast of the country would adversely impact supply and therefore power prices. Labor seemed to ignore that. That was 2012.
No, we were given, there were two pieces of advice given. First, which really is just basic economics, which is the price would converge with the Asian or the global price, and Malcolm Turnbull's recognised that as being the appropriate benchmark for his new security mechanism. But the industry building the gas export terminals in Gladstone made it very clear that that was going to be new gas got out of the ground in Queensland that would not impact local markets. What we've seen since is that gas has been diverted from the local market, particularly by the Santos consortium, and that's why 2 years ago we recognised this as a problem coming and advocated a national interest test. We were the only party that took an export control policy to the last election. We had to drag Malcolm Turnbull kicking and screaming to that this year. But between then or before then, he said that we were a sovereign risk, that we were economically irresponsible, arguing for export controls when it became clear to us and to manufacturers that those assurances that were given, that the local market would not be impacted, they would not take gas from the local market, were simply not coming to pass.
The federal government is calling on you to put pressure on the Labor governments of Victoria and the Northern Territory to help release domestic gas to the grid. Will you do that?
Well, we've made it very clear that we support responsible development of onshore gas. The other point to make is that really the expectation about getting new gas out of the ground that hasn't come to pass is essentially a New South Wales issue. There are issues in Victoria and the Northern Territory, but this is essentially a New South Wales issue. So Malcolm Turnbull might choose to pick on Labor states, but this is an issue that goes beyond just Labor states.
But will you put pressure on the Labor states to make more gas available domestically?
What I've made clear is that the Commonwealth can't just lecture, whether it's Labor or Liberal from Canberra, can't just lecture state governments, Liberal state governments or Labor state governments about the response that they've made to community concerns. The Commonwealth has a role to help nurture community consent to these developments where they can be done responsibly and safely. We put that in place with the support of Tony Windsor and Rob Oakeshott when we were in government, and Tony Abbott has stripped them all down, agitating or aggravating community concerns about this rather than seeking to nurture and mollify consent. So Malcolm Turnbull needs to take something to the table. We're up for that. We're up for that discussion. Something from the Commonwealth, like the Commonwealth Water Trigger, good resources into making sure there's independent analysis about water impacts, rather than just hectoring and lecturing state governments for political reasons.
Mark Butler, we have to leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks, Emma.